Racism is alive and, unfortunately, doing really well right now in the United States. Between hate crimes, immigration bans, police killings of Black people, and a lack of diversity in tech, racism is prevalent in nearly every aspect of our day-to-day lives. In the 2 months following the election, there were over 1,000 documented instances of bias-related harassment and intimidation toward immigrants, Black people, Muslim people, and LGBT people. For example, several mosques and Islamic centers around the country received an identical letter that described Muslims as children of Satan. Meanwhile, there's still a major lack of diversity in the industry and reports of racism and discrimination in the tech workplace. Today, I'm chatting with Justin Steele, principal of Google.org.
Justin Steele is principal at Google.org, the nonprofit arm of Google. Since its inception over 10 years ago, Google.org has committed nearly $100 million in investments and grants to nonprofit organizations. Last month, it donated $11 million to racial justice organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Are we at a point where we have to accept that racism is never going to go away?
I don't know if you have to accept that it's never going to go away. It's one of those historical problems that we've dealt with for hundreds of years, so it's obviously not going to go away quickly. I do think that by applying some of the social sort of disruption that we're seeing and some of the knowledge that we're trying to get to the surface and tell, I think we can make progress. Will it ever go away? I don't know. There's always been social identification based on all kinds of different factors, and so I think there's a human tendency to in-group, out-group that we might always see, but I think race can become less prevalent of something that's really determinative.
What are some of the most egregious examples of racial injustice in our society right now?
Well, certainly loss of life, right? I mean, I think the most egregious things you see is when someone loses their life, and partly due to the fact that they've been racially profiled or there's racial bias that exists. So, yeah, certainly the killings that we've seen, Philando Steele, Alton Sterling, those types of things are pretty egregious.
And what about specific to the tech industry?
In terms of kind of like racial bias that we see?
In terms of racial injustice.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've been clear with this, the numbers in tech have a lot of room for growth, and so we've seen lack of representation, and there's a lot of work that's being done to try to address that, but that's certainly a challenge.
So at Google, and this is across all tech companies, there's a lack of diversity. How hard is it to get Google employees on board with some of the racial justice initiatives that you're doing through Google.org? The
work actually wouldn't exist without the sort of enthusiasm and passion of the employees. When we actually started this work, it was largely riding the momentum of particularly the Black Googler network, which I'm a part of. We had done a hoodie march after Trayvon Martin, and one of the first mass consciousness raising moments inside the company, and that was led by the employees, led by the Black Googler network. And so when I started talking about actually funding racial justice work through Google.org, it wasn't the first time the company had the conversation, and we got the most momentum after the Charleston church shooting, again on the strength of our employees' sort of reaction in that moment and search to find an answer, and we were just really responding to what our employees were leading us.
So you mentioned the Black Googlers network. I'm curious about how to get allies on board and getting allies to support what the Black Googlers network is doing. One
thing that we've done in the Black Googler network is really encourage allies to join that email list and come to the events and make it open, like as an explicit invitation for others to join. And there's a great example recently of where that allyship really stepped up. We had hosted a screening of the film 13th, Ava DuVernay's film about mass incarceration, and one of the allies, an Asian American woman at Google, actually came to the 13th screening, was really inspired by it, heard the call to allyship, saw the Every 28 Hours play up here in the Bay Area, a play that really highlights the fact that every 28 hours a Black person in America is shot by a police officer or vigilante. And she brought that play to Google a couple weeks ago and put it on her back, organized it, did the marketing, convinced the executives to sponsor it, held it on campus. So I do think that there's an open invitation within the Black Googler network for allies to join and step up and do things like that.
And what about outside of Google? How do you think we can get more people in the tech community really focused on racial justice?
Well, part of it was what Brian Stevenson talks about, was just proximity. And oftentimes in our society, if you don't make a conscious effort, you're not going to be proximate to some of these really tough racial issues. Our society is obviously very segregated across lots of different factors, race being one of them. And so unless you're making a conscious effort to get proximate, you're probably not going to be confronting this. So I think efforts that we can do to really encourage people to get involved in some of the movements, get involved and read and go on your own journey, right? Like Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. It's like,
Right.
really you need to go on your own journey, and then you need to really make steps to get more proximate.
Right, so is that kind of the advice that you have maybe for people who want to do something about racial justice but aren't really sure where to begin, like read a book?
Well, yeah. So I think like it's partly, you look at the community organizing framework and you sort of start with the individual, the internal, right? And there's a lot of work that we all have to do internally to check our biases and understand more about the history and the knowledge. But as you start to move out from there, you start to talk about the interpersonal. Then it's like our relationship amongst each other and how we relate to each other. And then you can start to think about institutions and systems. A lot of times people, especially people in tech, want to jump straight to the systems and the institutions because that's where you can get a lot of leverage change. But I think when something like race, it's really important to start at that internal and interpersonal connectedness before you start to jump and try to change institutions and systems.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, because I mean, a lot of what's going on with racial injustice, it is systemic.
Yeah.
But you think that in order to really affect change, even though it's systemic, we need to still start on the individual
Well, I think it
level.
depends on whether you're talking about what the individual agency is versus an institution. I think what's been really powerful about Google stepping into racial justice's work is that we are a big institution and we can start to work at an institutional level. So if you look at our grant making, very little of it in the racial justice portfolio is actually focused on direct service work in communities of color. It actually is focused a little bit more on how do we change the narrative or paradigm on race that individuals believe through like Brian Stevenson's work on lynching in America. Or we're targeting the criminal justice system as a whole. So the Center for Policing Equity trying to look at police agencies as an institution, as a system, and looking at use of force and community trust. And so as an institution, we're actually pretty focused on the systemic side of it. I think as an individual, I think your first step as an individual needs to be internally.
Right.
I would really challenge institutions to work at the institutional level.
What do you think needs to happen next in order to advance racial justice?
I think a lot of it is about knowledge, right? And people's general sort of awareness of the topic. So the myth of racial difference took 200 years, right, to sort of build up. And I think it's something that's very deeply ingrained. And so if we're going to start to debunk that and eliminate things like mass incarceration that arise out of that myth, we're really going to need to educate ourselves. So again, going back to really starting at the internal level and going on your own journey to really understand the history and how we got here and where some of that bias comes from. And a lot of the implicit bias research that starts to make you aware of how your unconscious can really inform the topic in a negative way.
That makes sense. Thanks so much for your time, Justin.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me.
Catch Bullish on Wednesdays here at TechCrunch.com.